Hello and welcome to a little conversation about how to spice up your drums and make them punch harder and sound more lively. The main focus of this video will be on the overall drum sound rather than deep diving individual drums like kicks and snares and so on. In effect, think of this as how to process your overall drum group. We are going to look at a few techniques involving EQ, saturation, parallel compression, clipping and transient shaping. I'm going to mainly be using stock tools in Ableton Live, but also showcasing free alternatives for those that use other DAWs, especially when we get into clipping and transient shaping. The links to those VSTs will be in the description. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. It is always good to balance out the sound of your drums before you go into any other processing techniques, and this is best done with EQ. Here are the raw drums without any processing on them. While listening to them, we want to look at where we may possibly need to focus our attention on in terms of frequency areas. Let's split this into three parts: the lows, the mids and the highs. As you can hear, the kick and lows are very pronounced. The mids are a bit loose and could be tightened up a bit. And also the upper mids into the highs could use a little bit more presence. Now don't worry if you struggle to hear those issues. Ear training is a thing that takes time, but it is very much worth it. So let's start shaping the drums and see how much we can improve the sound of them just using EQ. So there we have it, just a little bit of work, shaping the overall drum sound, refining the lows. A useful tip to remember, and this applies to pretty much any drum sound, as long as you don't overdo it, but this can be from rock to dance music to lots and lots of different genres. Shape out the 500 Hz region, and if we pull it down and notch it a bit, this allows space for other instruments to sit in it. This is a technique that I've used for years, and it always works. It's very, very useful. Again, depending on the drum sound, depends on how much you will need to do it, but don't overdo it either. It's again just as a shaping thing, and this is to sort of leave space for other instruments to sit in. But let's listen to a before and after. You should always A and B the before and after as well. It should always sound better after the fact. As you saw there, I went in and just changed a few things because I'd pushed it a little bit too high in the high mids and the high frequencies. But again, take your time with this. This isn't something that should be rushed. And always A-B to see if it sounds better or worse after the fact. If it sounds worse, then you need to go back, maybe start again, or refine what you've done. Each song you make will have its own drum sound, and you will have to focus on slightly different areas, applying different shaping, but take time to learn what good drums sound like. Listen to your favourite tracks and try and emulate the colour of the drum sound with balancing EQ. This next processing technique is really useful to push the main hits of your drums a little harder and make your drums pop in the mix a little bit more. I'm going to combine two techniques here. The first will be transient shaping, but I'm also going to introduce some overall sub-weight into the drums as well. First, let's look at this with Ableton Live's drum bus. Just a little point about this section here. Depending on how much you want the overall sub to be, with Ableton Live's drum bus, the decay amount will obviously, if you put it to 100%, will ring out a lot longer. So if you want your drums to be tighter, it's definitely recommended pulling that down. And another point is, because this is basically in a sense adding a sine wave, you want it to match to the key of your music as well. So find the key, and you can actually do this via hertz as well, and if you're a little bit out, you can bring it and pull it back. I'm working on a project that is currently in the key of G minor, so you want it to be at the fundamental note of what your tune's key is actually in. Let's listen to this as an A-B. So this is without it. Now let's try some transient shaping with Flux's Bittersweet. I find this one a little bit more subtler, which can be really useful as well. Again, you don't want to push it too hard, but as I've just showcased, there's the difference between sweet and bitter. If you go too far into butty, you can see that's what I was mentioning before, that it can completely suck the life out of your drums. But let's A and B this. The main thing that it's capturing here is the kick and the snare and pushing the transient of those drum hits a little bit harder. Next, let's get into Basslane. This is the free version, not the pro version. It's made by Tone Project, and this is going to be used like we did in the Ableton Live drum bus, just to accentuate the sub weight of the drums overall. Again, this sounds a little bit subtler than the Ableton Live drum bus version, but it's allowing us just to add some more weight into the overall drum sound. So let's listen to the A and B of this with and without. So just a couple of options for non-Ableton Live users, or Ableton Live users as well, if you just want to use these free plugins as well. Next, we're going to look at clipping, and for this we're going to use a free tool by Ven Audio called FreeClip 2. This is a really cool plugin, and it sounds a little bit similar to saturation, but mainly what it's doing is taking the drums or whatever you put into it, and if you push the input gain, it's stopping everything at whatever you set the output gain to be, and this can cause things to sort of have that very clipped or distorted sound. Now you can be very subtle with this, or you can push it extremely hard. So I'm going to play around with the sound. I'm only going to stick with the clip type hard at the moment. There are many different clip types that you can play around with, but for this one I'm just going to stick with the hard version, which does sound good for drums inherently anyway. Some useful tips for this technique, a little bit like saturation. However much you push the in gain by, decrease the output gain by as well. Now they don't have to be exactly the same values, but use your ears just to hear how much of that sort of clipping sound that you want in your drums, from subtle all the way to extreme. Another thing as well, we're listening to the drums in isolation. A useful thing that would be to do is to listen to this in context with the rest of your tune as well. Because as much as these drums sound good by themselves, how do they sound within your track? Next we have saturation, and a little bit like the previous technique of clipping, this is to add a little bit more crunch to your drums. Now this can be extreme or subtle depending on what you're trying to achieve with your track. Overall really you're wanting to be quite subtle with your saturation. And again, previously as we did with the clipping, however much you push your drive by, decrease your output by a similar amount. So if you push your drive by 10 decibels, decrease your output by minus 10 decibels. And the cool thing with this is we're able to dry wet this as well, and also change the colour. Now there are different saturators out there, obviously each DAW has its own saturator as well, so try see which saturator you find the best to use. But let's have a play around experimenting with this sound. I'm going to turn off the clipping for this as well, just so we can hear the saturation by itself. And again, I want this to be extremely subtle, this saturation, with this kind of drum sound. If you're going into things like hardstyle or whatever, you're going to push these to the absolute extreme that you can. But for more live rock drums in this case, you just want it to be a little bit subtle to match the overall shape and sound of the drums that you're going for. But let's listen to the A and B of this as well. Don't worry if you couldn't hear the difference there. This is a very, very subtle effect that I'm using. But again, as I explained with the balancing EQ, training your ears over time, you will start to hear those slight changes and nuances within all of these kind of effects shaping that you're going to be using as processing on not just drums but other instruments as well. Next, let's look at parallel compression. And this is one of the really cool tools that can really bring your drums to life. I'm only going to focus on a few things within this compressor. I do actually have a full-blown tutorial on all of the differences and all of the elements inside of a compressor and different types of compressors as well. I'll put a link to that in the description, so go and check that out. But like I say, for this I'm only going to focus on a few things, and this is more to use compression in a parallel way, and this is going to involve the dry-wet mix. So let's process these drums with some parallel compression. So the main thing that I focused on there is bringing the threshold quite far down, so into minus 30 decibels almost, and then bringing the ratio up to 6:1. As you can hear, that sort of really made it give it a super compressed sound. The next thing was reducing the release. As you heard, when I increased the release time, it made everything start to sound a little bit quieter. as the release was taking too long to stop the compressor from compressing the overall drum sound. So bringing that down, for this I found around about 13.6 milliseconds. The next thing that I did, as you saw, was start to increase the output, but turning the compressor off and on, because what I was trying to do was match the original loudness to, match the compressor loudness to the original loudness of the drums, which then would allow me, so when I got to the dry wet part, I'm not getting an extreme jump in loudness when the compressor is activated, and then I can have sort of 50% dry to wet, which I could change this to depending on how much I want the parallel compression to hit and how subtle or really strongly influencing the sound of the drums I want this parallel compressor to be. But let's have a listen to that again, A, B. As you can hear, it's again quite subtle, but it's brought up the overall floor of the drums in terms of loudness. So you can hear it mainly in the cymbals, the sort of ring out of the cymbals, and a little bit in the tail of the kick and the snare as well. So this is really sort of, it glues the overall drum sound together, which is a really useful thing to do. And finally, after all of those techniques that we looked at, we're just going to look at some final shaping, like we did at the beginning with the balancing EQ, and then a little bit with the limiter for some loudness. So the main thing I was doing with that EQ, a little bit like I was doing before, just shaping the lows, notching out that 500 Hz mid, which is really, really important for your rest of instruments to sort of sit in that place, especially things that are like vocals, keyboard sounds, lead lines, guitars, that kind of thing. And I did find the cymbals were getting a little bit too over-present in the drum sound. So again, just refining that area a little bit. And then after this, we can just do some loudness with the limiter. You don't want to push the limiter too hard. If you're having to push it a massive amount, go back and look through all of your other plugins that you've been using to process and shape the overall drum sound. Anyway, that's an overview of a few different techniques you can use to process your drum sound overall. Obviously from EQ to saturation to parallel compression and some final balancing stuff as well. I hope you found this tutorial really useful. The link to all of the free VSTs, if you don't use Ableton Live, is in the description as a reminder. Also, I have a Patreon as well, which has some free stuff that you can grab, and it has a shop with some useful things from Ableton Live packs to sample packs as well. So you can check that out, link to that's in the description. But anyway guys, thanks for tuning in. As always, until next video, God bless and goodbye.